Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for being here. I'm Ross, Virginia. I'm a professor in the Environmental Studies program, and it's also my great privilege to direct the Institute of Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth, which is part of the Dickey Center for International Understanding. It's always a real pleasure to have someone back to Dartmouth from Dartmouth, and today we're really fortunate to have Dr. William Fitzhugh, class of 1964. Bill Fitzhugh. He's director of the Arctic Study Center at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Bill's truly one of the world's leading Arctic archaeologists and anthropologists, and he's been specializing in ethnology, environment, and trying to understand human-environment relationships in the Arctic through the development of people in the north. I think Bill got his interest in the Arctic from canoeing and hiking and just wanting to be in these kinds of places, and eventually found the anthropology department here. And not only anthropology, but he found Elmer Harp. And there are some people in this audience that know Elmer and know just what an amazing person and mentor and archaeologist that Elmer was and what he contributed to Dartmouth as an institution. Bill became associated with Elmer, and with Elmer went into the Canadian Arctic in the east, and became involved in a number of digs there. After graduating from Dartmouth, he had a stint in the Navy, and from there to Harvard, where he earned his PhD in anthropology. And I think you went straight to the Smithsonian from there. So this is a case where someone found the perfect job and the perfect fit. He left Harvard, he went to the Smithsonian Museum, and has been there his entire career. Bill's work is characterized by trying to understand the history of Inuit peoples in the north, and in particular the relationship and the context between Inuit and Arctic peoples and Europeans. And he's been involved in a number of very major and important digs in association with learning about that. Recently he's gotten involved in some other projects too. He's gotten fascinated in human-reindeer interactions, and that's taken him to Mongolia. I don't know, you've had several trips now to Mongolia, and he's looking at the relationships between Mongolian people and potentially peoples to the north, their contact, their art, the history of that environment, and how people sustain themselves in these grazing systems. Bill's in charge of a national treasure, the Arctic collection at the Smithsonian, and part of that responsibility is to share that with the world. And Bill's done that in a lot of different ways. It comes through his research, through his expertise in curating that collection, but in sharing that collection. And he's been responsible for a number of major international exhibitions around the Arctic materials at the Smithsonian. And if you're a fan of NOVA and some of the specials around Arctic people and environment and the Vikings and the Norse and that whole history, you've undoubtedly seen some of Bill's NOVA specials and some of the other films that he's directed. So he's made a very major contribution to sharing knowledge about the Arctic with the public. Bill's also been just a great friend to the Institute of Arctic Studies and to Dartmouth anthropology in general. He's hosted a number of students on his field projects. There's 2 students currently at Dartmouth that have worked with him in Newfoundland on his latest work. So it's a real pleasure to have Bill back with us, class of 64. Bill always talks about big things and big subjects. I notice he's got 3 sort of themes that he's linking in his talk, and they're very large. They have to do with climate change, archaeology, and the history of the Arctic. So welcome back, Bill.
Thank you, Ross.
Thank you.
Well, it is a great pleasure to be here, and actually I'm beginning to feel like I might be a professor, because the last time I was here I was standing right in this same place when we had a memorial for Elmer Harp a couple of years ago. So it really is a pleasure to be here, and maybe I did pick out too many themes. We'll see how it goes here. But I did think that since the changes that we're experiencing in the world, but especially in the north, are really momentous now. And I'm a part of a group down in Washington called the Interagency Arctic Research Committee. And we have, in the last couple of years, been working quite hard to try to get the U.S. government to put as much resources as they possibly can into understanding what's going on in the world up north. I think there will be arguments until doomsday about the effect of climate on temperate parts of the world, whether it's drier or colder or windier or more hurricanes or less or whatever. But in the Arctic, that isn't a question at all. I mean, the native people in the Arctic out in St. Lawrence Island began expressing the idea a couple of years, well, 10 years ago, that we are in a new regime, a new climate regime. And they experienced it through the weather and through the animals and many things which they recognized had changed just in the, about 10 years ago. I think the scientists, had an inkling something was going on, but they want all the data, and the data sometimes isn't as clean as they wish it would be, and so there's always been this kind of question. Although, of course, I think 99% of the scientists who are climate-related people are sure that we are going into this new regime, and that it's going to, we don't really know where it's taking us. So it's a very interesting time to be alive. And at the end of the talk, I want to talk just for a few minutes about the Vinland map, because when I was at Dartmouth, the Vinland map got discovered and published in this elaborate book, and everybody was raving about it. And then we've gone through 50 years of talk about how it couldn't be, because Greenland was shown on the Vinland map as an island, and no one could have actually circumnavigated that island back in the Norse times. So now we're starting to look at a time when we can circumnavigate the North, and I'm beginning to have worries that the proponents of the Vinland map are going to rear their heads again to try to prove that it is true, because it is an island. So anyway, we'll take a look at that. But first of all, I want to go through some history in the North a little bit, starting in Siberia, and then come around into Labrador, where I've been working most of my time, show you some examples of how cultures have been affected by climates of the past, and then we'll go into some of the mechanics of why this is happening, and then where are we likely to be going in the future. So this opening slide is, most of the pictures I'm going to show of the graph-type pictures are from the Arctic Climate Assessment, the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment, ACIA report, which is now a few years old, but and needs to be updated, probably will be updated fairly soon. There's some pretty dramatic changes even since their report, always on the direction of warmer weather, less ice, and so forth. So we are experiencing really something that we couldn't have expected, and those of us interested in the history of the Arctic are going back to the old records of the explorations in Canada and all those lost ships that were crunched in the ice, and some of them are beginning to be discovered archaeologically now. Parks Canada has been working on the Investigator. So we are really moving from an ice age type of environment in the North to something that is very different indeed. This is a slide I like to use because of the projection. Most people familiar with the Mercator map don't see something like this, and if you're an Arctic archaeologist or an Arctic biologist, this makes a whole lot of sense, and it really is, it illustrates wonderfully the concept of how the Arctic Ocean is almost like a lake surrounded by land masses, and animals and people can flow relatively easily from one end of the Arctic to the other, and they have done that historically. We have a lot of evidence of migrations. If someone picks up a new idea, it very rapidly can be transmitted through this zone, because people were living on the animals that are pretty much everywhere in the North. The same animals, the same whales, seals, walrus, birds. And if you harpoon a seal in Yamal in Russia, that seal may turn up over in North Greenland or in Alaska. And so a guy who develops a better harpoon in one place can find within a year or two somebody picking that harpoon out of a wounded seal or a seal that's survived. So there's a lot of mechanisms as well as just human transport. Zhukov is a pretty interesting place. I won't talk too much about it, but I did want to show you where it is. It's a site a colleague of mine has been working on for about 10 years, a remarkable archaeological site about 8,000 years old. And here he is. This is Vladimir Pitulko of the Russian Institute of Archaeology in St. Petersburg. He discovered this site and started coming in June, but it isn't until late July that the snow is melted down about this far, and he's working overtime to try to get down to the dirt. Anyway, this is the kind of image that a lot of us have had about the Arctic over the years, and of course it has been pretty real. There's also questions about where are we, and people linking Eskimos and Paleolithic people together. There were many theories about the origins of Eskimos, and many people thought that they were basically the Paleolithic peoples of Europe who moved into Scandinavia and became sea mammal hunters and reindeer hunters and spread around the world. But there is this interesting connection, this popular motif goes around. And the rest of the world became familiar with Eskimos mostly. I use the Eskimos in the old historic sense here. Today we call them Inuit in most places in the Arctic. But this is the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. And they had a lot of Inuit people from Labrador and various other places down entertaining the public with dog sleds and wearing fur clothes in the middle of the Chicago summer. Not a very comfortable way to be an Inuit. On the other hand, what we're seeing now in the north is something very different, even from our imaginations. I was on a cruise, a Smithsonian cruise with a lot of clients, people who paid to go on this thing, and there were about 8 of us, scientists of different kinds, and we thought we were just going to go up into the north in a routine kind of Arctic summer, push the ice away, and maybe get to Wrangel Island, which has been kind of like a major destination for 18th and early 19th century, well, 19th and early 20th century explorers. But here we are, north side of Wrangel Island, and you show me the ice. And, this place was completely unapproachable during most of the historical time. So we just put our Zodiacs in the water, and we did discover some walrus and had some pretty interesting times. We had Russian Park Service people with us, and it was a very interesting place to go. There were a lot of ancient mammoths here I'll talk about in a minute too, but you could look to the Arctic to the north and not see any ice as far as the eye could see. This is 2007. We didn't realize it, but we were in the minimum ice year of all time. And that minimum ice year was repeated again this summer. So a few years ago, we did an exhibit at the Smithsonian. We called it Arctic, a Friend Acting Strangely. And this was one of the motifs that we used for the exhibit. Also a little bit because there was some fear at the time that talking about climate change was politically unacceptable. It still is, sort of. So we put this little loop at the far end of the graph as the temperature's going up there, and put a bunch of different arrows, one for the conservatives and one for the liberals, and so forth. But this is the Ice Age, and here is the Younger Dryas, and then this huge, very rapid change that occurred, and the last 10,000 years of cultural development after that. So we hope to diffuse some people by introducing a little humor into the subject. Here's the same graph from a climate curve. This is mostly from the ice core studies, and it just shows you that circumpolar zone with the ice caps, which were all over North America and Greenland, but you see distinctively missing from western Alaska, the Bering Land Bridge exposed here, about 1,000 kilometers wide, all of northeastern Asia, and only till you get to Taimyr and the western Siberian area in Scandinavia do you get another big ice sheet. So this is really important for cultural development, because it meant that all of the peoples who are living around here, when the climate got a little better, when you start rising this curve, all of a sudden people are able to move all the way north. This is the edge of the continental shelf exposed here, and of course down in here. So it was much easier for cultures to adapt and move into the higher Arctic zones as soon as temperature allowed them and their adaptations allowed. Whereas in northern part of America and Scandinavia, you're literally limited by blocks of ice or by really bad conditions that didn't get much better until 10,000 years ago. So this is all grassland, and it was a big mecca for mastodons and rhinoceroses and all sorts of things. A lot of food to eat. And the vegetation zones of the region, this is Yamal here, but you can see the Arctic ringed by A lot of lowlands in here, very mountainous as you get into northeastern Siberia and North Alaska, but then this lowland that is basically an extension of the Russian plain into North Alaska until you get to the Mackenzie River. And so I'll show you later on how these vegetation zones are expected to change. So I was interested, one of my interests have been the origins of Eskimo culture and particularly Eskimo art, something that Henry Collins at the Smithsonian, who was my mentor and previous curator of the Northern materials, had been working on all his life, and we never really had been able to figure out what happened before 2,000 years ago in Eskimo culture. I became aware of some things in Mongolia down in here that looked like they might link up to early concepts in Eskimo art, and I sort of been shifting over there, working there a month every summer on the Bronze Age, which is about the right time period. And that's the story I really can't tell you about tonight, but I have a feeling that we are starting to see linkages in this area here. This also is very archaeologically unknown, this region. So in terms of the peopling of North America and South America and many other things, there's still huge areas that are really pristine and need to be researched, but have some political difficulties, shall I say. North Korea and also the geography is very mountainous, very difficult. So Zhukov is off here on the edge. Here's the continental shelf out here. Zhukov is this little tiny island up in here, and Petulko invited me to come out. And there's another site I'll mention, Yana, which is right here. So this is the first, Yana. Yana is just being explored now by Petulko. It's on a river, the Yana River, which empties out in the New Siberia, into East Siberian Sea, into the Laptev Sea, sorry. But working in Russia is very difficult because much of it is frozen mud. And this site, they discovered tusks of elephants and simple stone tools. They have a lot of faunal remains from their food. It's really a fantastic site. But you can see it was originally just eroding out of the bluff, a frozen bluff. Here they've worked that bluff back so they could get down to a level which is about 15 meters below the top of the terrace, the level at which this elephant hunting people were living. And they found domestic materials and all sorts of stuff there. There's an article in Science, but much of it isn't published yet. And the most amazing thing is it's like 30,000 years ago. So it is right in the middle of the last ice age. And here are people living up there, hunting elephants and many other animals, and then having their sites covered over by meters and meters of mud. It's not easy to dig into a wall. And that's basically what you have to do. You have to let this stuff melt very gradually, and you try to dig off the overburden so you can get down to where you actually have that level outcropping here. But 30,000 years ago is a pretty remarkable date for people living on the edge of what we now see as the Arctic Ocean. This is about 10,000 years later, and this is a line that shows you the birch zone of birch trees, growth along the northern part of Eurasia. And you can see all these birch samples coming from much farther north locations. This is just an indication that the climates back around 10,000 to 8,000, 7,000 years ago were much warmer than they have been recently. We're approaching that temperature again today, but but you see the birch zone has depressed. And of course, this was all dry land out here for much of that time. Probably the seacoast was around in here at the time the birch was growing out in these areas. So paleontologists and paleobotanists and others are giving us lots of information about the environments that these people were living in. This is another site that Petulko has worked on and that I spent a month at. Zhukov Island. It's a little tiny island in the New Siberian island chain, the Long Islands, actually. And it was found by a Russian weather observer who said, hey, there's a lot of wood and bones sticking out here. And so Petulko came by and began excavating it. And it's the most amazing thing is how this site is completely full of wood. And of course, you look around the country, there's no wood there anywhere. Actually, all this wood was probably rafted down the Lena River and out along the shore, which at that time, the coast of the Arctic Ocean was 200 kilometers north of where it is today, right around Jokoff Island. So the people who came out here they were actually hunting two animals. They were hunting polar bears and hunting reindeer. A pretty unusual combination for people to go after. The polar bears were being hunted in their snow dens. Some of you probably have seen those the bears tumbling out of the snow dens on Wrangel Island. The Russians have made some good films about that. And the reindeer would come out from the south every summer and come up to this zone, so that they were sort of intersecting both animal types. We had thought maybe this is an Eskimo origin story, but we could find no harpoons, no evidence that people were hunting seals or walrus or other animals. They were basically land hunters who came to the edge of the water and discovered polar bears and found that was pretty good stuff too. So here's one of my great finds. This is a basket. It's grass, and that's 8,000 years old, and it was just sitting there in the mud, frozen since they dropped it. On the other side, you can see the incredible difficulty of digging these sites, because all of the timbers and things they built their houses out had been squished around by permafrost and mostly turned on end, so that digging a site is kind of like being a mite on the back of a porcupine. You know, you're sitting there with your trowel trying to get between the sticks of the wood to find these little critters, and it takes a long time. And Pitulko had a wonderful team, and they've done a great job and made some great finds as well. Wrangel Island is this little dot up here, and one of the interesting finds from Wrangel has been the discovery just in the last few years of pygmy elephants that were found up there. This is the normal-sized critter here, a mammoth, and here's the kind of size the guy that they've found paleontologically there. And they radiocarbon dated these guys, thinking they would just be, like young elephants, but actually they're adults, and their age was about 5,000 years old, even a little younger, which is about 5,000 years later than we ever had any other evidence of prehistoric, mammoths or mastodons. So there's kind of a refugium, and we think that what happened is the sea levels rose, that they became isolated on Wrangel Island and just hung out there until they couldn't hang out any longer, probably because it's a relatively small island, not enough habitat for them. But there is also an archaeological site not far away on that island, and that site dates to around 4,500 years ago. So we have a few hundred years. And we're wondering, maybe the first Chukchi, the prehistoric Chukchi, may have actually got out there and had a field day on small elephants. Not sure. But the exact same thing has happened over here in one of the Pribilof Islands. They discovered some mammoth bones that were small, pygmy-sized, also dating around 5,000 years ago. So this was a zone where these animals, were kind of, as the sea levels rose, they found themselves restricted into places where there weren't any people, at least for a while. And on the other side of Russia, this is just this is a site I worked on with some other people. It's a Neolithic site dating about 4,000 years ago. And what was interesting was this diagram up here. This is a shot of the excavation of one of these walls. And you see this podsole, this gray sandy zone. Here's another one on top here. And these gray sandy zones are kind of dipping down into this kind of V-shaped notch. And this is a frost wedge, and it's been filled in and cut these podsole zones. And so we had an earlier time in the Yamal when temperatures were warm enough to make podsoles. That's a temperature that's like around here, not too much further north, southern boreal forest and so forth. And then it got colder, and you get these Chernozems and then more frost wedging. So here's a time when Neolithic people making lots of pottery in what is now tundra, and not much to fire pottery with and so forth. We generally don't find a lot of pottery in the Arctic, but superseded by cold waves, which depressed the forest zone and produced a new culture, which was basically based on reindeer herding after that. Okay, I want to just shift towards North America, and my colleague this very same day in Washington, Dennis Stanford, is hosting a book party for his new book that is coming out with Bruce Bradley, published by Stanford Press, in which he is floating the idea that that there is a major component in North American archaeology going into what we call Clovis culture, which was spread all around this part of the New World, of North America, that these people may not have come through Asia or along the coast or down through the ice-free corridor, but may have come from northern Spain and France, from the Solutrean culture, which is dated about 16,000 to 20,000 years ago. So there's a big hullabaloo going down there, and a lot of people are talking about how this is impossible, and people couldn't have crossed the Atlantic, and they must be from Asia, and so forth. So we're really in a time when there's a lot of things changing about the way we view the world. I think it's very possible that some of these early late Paleolithic people might have traveled along the edge of the ice rim at the edge of the North Atlantic. It's actually not very troublesome to be on the edge of a floating ice sheet. We've done it in Labrador quite a lot in the summers. There's no waves, there's lots of game, you just don't want to stay there too long. And if your boat if you've got a skin boat, you just pull it out on the ice, let it dry out, and start over again. So I think it is possible, but the only problem is that the evidence we have from eastern North America still is pretty scant for pre-12,000-year-old archaeological stuff. So Eskimos. Now Eskimos, this is the distribution of Eskimos from South Alaska around down to Labrador and all around Greenland. An amazing distribution of a people who first moved into probably Alaska around 6,000 years ago from North Asia, and then developed in this area and spread in 3 waves, first as pre-Dorset people into the eastern Arctic around 4,000 years ago in a relatively warm period where there wasn't too much ice. And these guys really weren't seal hunters. They were caribou hunters and muskox hunters. And they were followed by another culture which developed from pre-Dorset called Dorset culture here. And then there is another culture, the Thule culture, which began in the Western Arctic, and they are whale hunters. And we'll talk a little bit more about whale hunting and what happened. But this is the distribution of those cultures. The Thule culture, about 1200 AD, moved into the Canadian Arctic and down Labrador and here, and replaced the Dorset people and became the ancestors of the modern Inuit. So, some Labrador material. This is the central coast of Labrador, a beautiful area with islands offshore and mixed shrub and spruce and tundra, depending on the elevations and exposure and so forth. So we've spent many, many years working in this area since the 1970s, and work continues with Stephen Loring and others Susan Kaplan, who are continuing to work in this area. It's a beautiful area. It's got uplift. It was all covered with ice, and as the ice melted off the land, floated up. And so raised beaches on which all these sites at different time periods were settled. And so you actually have a nice chronology of going up the hillsides of these sites, and the only problem is you don't have a lot of organic material because the weather's a little bit too wet and warm. But this is the kind of country we see. This is Newfoundland down at the bottom, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Hamilton Inlet, and up to Hudson Strait here. And so you see the interior, the big spruce forest down here, the lichen woodlands, which is kind of like the last slide, and then tundra on the coast. And because the Labrador Current moves south, carrying ice and cold water out of the north, there is a tundra strip all the way around into northern Newfoundland and down into the Gulf. And so this is basically an extension of the Arctic environment. And we find, and we'll show you, that this extension has changed drastically over time as a result of climate changes, and that the cultures have responded to that, those changes. This is a pollen diagram that just shows the big break here when you have the grasses and the sedges and things from the tundra begin to be replaced by the spruce that appear, spruce and fir, when the climate started getting warm. And so we were able to reconstruct a vegetation history and link the vegetation changes in Labrador to the culture changes. And that's summarized in this big series of maps. And you will notice quite a lot of change. Basically, oh no, this isn't the earliest one. Anyway, this is getting recent over here. There's not that much change in this time period, but I forgot an earlier slide. where you do get a lot of vegetation change. Here's some of the beach ridges. This is actually a shot from Greenland. I didn't have one handy today, but it's the same process with the melting of glacial ice. The land floats up, and people who are marine hunters live always right by the shore. And so you find their very early sites here, and they just get progressively more recent to the modern day. So it's a tremendous asset for archaeological work. You don't always have to be running $600 radiocarbon samples all the time. And the other assets were just the food. This is caribou, which is very prominent all over the Arctic regions and into the northern forest zone. Tremendous resource for people, providing them with almost everything they need. And the early Indians were the first people into Labrador. We call them the Maritime Archaic people. They moved in from the south, and there was ice in the interior in the early days till around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. But these Indians were very maritime oriented, and they moved up the coast. And when they got to the northern part, they discovered these wonderful chert quarries, which they used for making tools for thousands of years. This was around 6,000, 7,000 to 4,000 years ago. And so it was during that sort of warm hypsothermal period where the weather was pretty good, the seas were calm. These people they used big axes and gouges, and we're pretty sure they had Northwest Coast style, almost that big, log boats, which they were probably, bringing up north from the forested regions further south. So they probably weren't using skin boats, but we don't have absolute evidence. One of the great sites is at Port au Choix, Newfoundland, which was the site where Elmer Harp introduced me to archaeology, western part of Newfoundland. And one of the finds Jim Tuck made there, not in the Dorset site, but in the Maritime Archaic Indian site, was this beautiful killer whale, and very characteristic, that large fin. So these are some amazing burial grounds that they found with beautifully ground slate tools, bone harpoons, even a harpoon that gets to be almost like an Eskimo harpoon over here. Here's some of that ramachert used for chipstone and the gouges. This is from a burial we excavated in Rattler's Bight near Hamilton Inlet back in the 1970s. Later on, we moved north, and we actually found the house types that go with these cultures. They were living in long houses, really big surprise. We thought they were going to be just in small little tents and things like that, but here they were in 100-meter long houses with little sort of compartments every 3 or 4 meters with a hearth in the middle, and you can see individual hearths all the way going down here. So these early maritime Indians were really living pretty well on the coast of Labrador, and we think one of the reasons was because the climate was good and the weather summertime was pretty favorable. Here's an excavation shot showing all of these hearths. And when we first dug this site, we just couldn't figure out what was going on because we didn't have stones to connect the houses. We didn't know where the walls were. We thought maybe these were just little tents that had been sort of superimposed over the years. Turns out it was one big longhouse. When we got further north, it was possible to see the rock foundations that were used. And in this area, it was sandy, and they weren't bothering to do that. So this went on in this early time period here when the forest was quite far north, west of Hudson Bay. This is a chart from that area. And then all of a sudden, around 3,500 years ago, there was a precipitous drop, a southern migration of the forest. Probably a result of climate cooling and a combination of forest fires that would kill off the northern part of the forest, and it wouldn't regenerate. So this was one pretty good indicator of the changes to come, and it brought also a new culture into Labrador, what we call the pre-Dorset people. These are some of these people who moved in from Alaska with a totally different technology, a Siberian chipstone technology, beautiful little tools, almost like machine-made, gorgeous pieces. And they were always using really multicolored, beautiful chert and flints. So they appeared in the Canadian Arctic, moved down into Labrador, and stayed there for about 1,000 years almost. And here's one of their houses, mid-passage here, and then one tent space here and another one over here. Very different than these big long houses of the Indians, who they actually coexisted with. And that's a really interesting story, but we really don't have time to talk about it. So then, after around 2,000 years later, or 1,000 years later, the Dorset people moved south, another group moving from the central Canadian Arctic down into Labrador and all around Newfoundland. And I'll talk a little bit more about that and why. Here's one of the beautiful so-called flying bear from one of the Dorset sites in the central Canadian Arctic. Here's a piece I found, a little soapstone carving of a guy from a Dorset house with a little open hood, and we used to make fun of the idea that the Dorsets were kind of strange people. Didn't have dogs, they didn't have bows and arrows, they didn't have all the useful things that other Eskimos always had, and they wore hoods that were open so they would catch all the snow. I don't know, maybe they had a zipper, but anyway, it's a beautiful little piece, and then we found also this interesting mask. A lot of art in the Dorset culture, but much of it was shamanistic. Bill Ritchie, a friend of ours, an artist in Newfoundland, did this reconstruction of a Dorset tent house, a winter tent house. They began to build their houses partly underground to insulate them better. This is a period when there was what we call a boreal period, colder period in the climate around 500 BC to around 2,000 years ago. And we think that the southward migration of the Dorset people down the Labrador coast from the central Arctic down here had a lot to do with the expansion of the Labrador Current and the establishment of a big spring and winter pack ice zone for harp seal birthing down in the southern regions. When we put all this together, we have this huge chart that shows you Eskimo people from the north and all these different cultures, and coming up in time, Indian cultures on the southern Labrador and in the forest areas. So it just gives you a sense of how these cultures interdigitated according to shifts, probably in combination of forest boundary shifts, but more dynamically in terms of the pack ice. Because if you can't really change a forest boundary very fast one way or the other, but in a single year you can have a major cutback or expansion of the Labrador Current and the pack ice down into the Newfoundland and even further south than that. And we related these to cold weather here. This is from the Camp Century, one of the early curves from the Camp Century ice core. It's warming up here. Here's 10,000 years ago. And then you see like peak warming spell here, 6,500, and then it's cooler, and another one around 4,500. And then you have the Eskimos showing up as this weather's cooling. Then you have another spike at 3,000, and Indians move north. Then you have the Dorset people coming in this cold spell. And then they disappear, and they're replaced by Labrador Inuit people who move south during the Little Ice Age. And I think all these southern Inuit or Eskimo movements are related to changes in the sea ice and the animals associated with it. So this is a Thule harpoon from Alaska. This is a whaling harpoon. It's a pretty big thing, and you needed a big harpoon to catch a big whale, simple as that, and floats and so forth. All this technology got developed in Alaska. Today, the North Alaskans still not only make a living, but have a strong spiritual connection to whales, and this is one of the modern whaling scenes. As you know, there's a lot of concern about whales and their numbers and so forth, bowheads particularly, but there's been quite a lot of growth in the bowhead population over the years, and the quotas are rigidly adhered to. So it is still very much a part of their culture and life. But it allowed them to take advantage of this new resource, these whales that were not really being used in the central and eastern part of the Canadian Arctic. And so about 1,200, the Thule whalers began to expand to the east, out of Alaska, into Canada. And the reason is because of these whale stocks, which were previously isolated. This is the Pacific Bering Sea stock, Davis Strait stock of bowheads here. And you can see the gap in the middle. There's just too much ice in those years for these whales to transmigrate and find air under the ice. Today, these bands are completely closed, and there was a report for the second summer in a row that people observed two whales that they recognized as as an Atlantic bowhead and another was a Pacific bowhead meeting. And according to the story I read in the press, they circled each other for 2 days, said goodbye, and went back to their homelands. Now, I don't know how they knew which one was which and what happened. But anyway, that's the idea. And it certainly had an impact on the Thule people and enticed them to move through this zone, where they then discovered Norse over here, and Norse had iron. They were very interested in iron and so forth, and things really took off. So this is that scene. This is the Norse moving in around 1000 AD, and the Thule people moving down here, meeting in this zone and creating this first encounter of people who have migrated, from the Africa to Europe and across the Atlantic, meeting this other arm of humanity that came around through Asia for the first time. And that was, this is the Thule culture from Peter Schlederman's article in National Geographic, just to show you the kind of culture they had. And in the wintertime, living in semi-subterranean houses. In the summer, skin tents, butchering whales down here, and so forth. They were a very powerful culture with a lot of very interesting technology, exactly adapted to the northern areas in a much better way than the Dorset and pre-Dorset people had been earlier. Cross-section of their houses that were very warm in the wintertime, sod and earth covered. Egil Knuth, a Greenland archaeologist, a Danish archaeologist in Greenland, discovered this kayak way up in northeast Greenland. This is some Thule people who got that far, and according to his story from the 1960s and 70s, they were blocked by ice, couldn't go further, so they left their boat, and that's where he found it. This also figures into the Vinland map story, because what are Thule guys doing up there with boats? Well, at least one boat did get that far. And then, of course, the modern Inuit and the Thule people also developed these snow houses, which were probably originally a Dorset invention that the Thule people took over after they met them. So here's another Bill Ritchie illustration of some Thule hunters meeting sort of askance, wondering what this Norse crowd is up to. There was contact between them, and we found artifacts that have moved in both directions across those cultures, but there wasn't a huge amount of contact. The Norse came across the Atlantic in a warm period around 1200, 11 to 12, actually it's 870 to Iceland, and 985 to Greenland, Eric the Red, and then Leif Erikson coming down to Newfoundland around 1000 AD. So that big expansion, and then they departed these areas because they really couldn't manage to keep going, and they kept their colonies going until around 1450. But even then, with the onset of the Little Ice Age, they really couldn't hack it there. This is Lansom Meadows, and a beautiful little carving that was found in a Thule house in Hudson Strait. So they did establish this bridgehead. Now, if you haven't gone to Newfoundland and visited Lansom Meadows, how many people have seen Lansom Meadows? Hey, pretty good crowd. Need more. It's a wonderful trip. And here's the Norse housefly. You can track the Norse migrations in different ways, sometimes with artifacts, but if you're an entomologist, you can actually track them by the housefly, because they brought this housefly along with them, and you can find little beetle parts and fly parts in the sites that indicate, yes, indeed, here we are. So they brought a lot of stuff, but it all fell apart in the 1400s. This is the Valsey Church, which was abandoned probably around the 1420s, and the last recorded wedding was 1408, recorded in Iceland, and in this very church. So then we have Europeans returning again in the 1800s, Parry and others, and this is in the Little Ice Age. And as you know, it was pretty hard for the Europeans to make much steam. What was going on was this kind of stuff. This is sea ice chart from Iceland. And you've got, the ice shows up off the north coast of Iceland, and you can see it's extremely variable, but here's the central parts of those curves. But there are periods when there's relatively little, and then there's periods when there's a lot. And people are tracking this now by using seat cores and looking at detritus from the bottom, which gives some indication of ice cover. So it's extreme variability, but they're out sort of in the middle of the Atlantic. Studies of dust from the Greenland ice core Here's a period starting around 1400. You're getting a huge amount of increases in atmospheric dust in the ice cores in Greenland up to about 1750, pretty much coinciding with what we see as the Little Ice Age. Giff Miller recently thinks it may have started back in here because he found some vegetation underneath ice in northern Baffin Island that he thinks was killed by a couple of volcanic eruptions, which really cooled the Earth down and precipitated the Little Ice Age. Interesting new theory. I won't bother you with this, it's too complicated, but if you just look at the colors are all different cultures. So you can see a lot of movement of this very dynamic area in Labrador. And this is the Dorset people as they're coming south. I showed you that one earlier. Here's the Labrador coast, central part of the Labrador coast. Land-fast ice, which is frozen in the wintertime. This is the Sheena, where people hunt and birds and seals collect, and then have the moving pack ice, which moves south. So in stable winters, you get a big expansion of this shore-fast ice out here. If you've got a lot of storms, it breaks away and keeps in close. Harp seals are the major resource for all the cultures, whether they're ocean-going Indians like the Maritime Archaic, but especially the Eskimo groups. Harp seal was the most dependable and biggest resource from the marine zone. And without harp seals, basically, I don't think it would have been possible for Inuit or Eskimo cultures to live on the coast. Here's what the coast looks like in May. As the ice is breaking up, after the new seals have been born off the Labrador and down in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and Steve Loring took this picture a few years ago. All these black dots are seals. So it's a huge, huge resource. There's estimates of up to 8 or 9 million harp seals alive today, and they migrate from Greenland. In the summertime, they're up here in Greenland, and then they migrate down in October, November, and December, arriving in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Then, after having their pups, they move out. One goes this way, and others go this way, but they go offshore and up to Greenland in the open sea. So this is connected to my current research, which is down in here, and we're looking at the appearance, the southern expansion of Inuit people who came down here around 1600, just at the time that the Little Ice Age was at its peak, and I suspect the big buildup of harp seal populations had taken place in this area. So we're beginning to investigate directly, can we see this in sea cores, in sediments, in indicators like foraminifera, or get a temperature kind of profile of that era, and also something to indicate whether there's ice cover or not, because there are now forams that indicate whether you have ice cover as well as open water. So we're very curious now about this system in the south, because the Dorset culture disappears from Newfoundland precipitously about 800 AD. And then the Thule people show up around 1500, and we think that maybe the disappearance of the Dorset, particularly these people living at Elmer Harp's site at Port au Choix, now been excavated by Priscilla Renouf, may have had a calamity with a warming phase that wiped out the winter seals, winter ice for the seals. Without the ice here, the seals would have to pop, way out over in here. So a huge kind of mechanism for culture change. So one of my colleagues at the Smithsonian, Walter Adey, has been doing some work on what he calls coralline algae. They're kind of like coral lumps. And here they are gathering some of these off the coast of Labrador, and then they section them, and they're able to see very fine-grained calcium deposits that even can be traced back to maybe even 1 or 2 months. Using very precise sampling and so forth, they can get water temperature out of these things, going back to, right now, they've got them back about 800 years, and they think they may be able to find some of these animals who lived, as long as maybe even 2,000 or 3,000 years further north. This is what they look like. They're not real beautiful. And this is from Peta Moody, but it's this curve over here shows you the ice and no ice kind of boundary based on forems up in the Baffin Bay area. And you can see it's quite variable. So this would be a period when you'd have relatively little ice, and over here you'd have more ice. And so we'd like to see if we can get some oceanographic studies down in the Labrador-Newfoundland area like this to really test out this hypothesis about the Dorsets and the arrival of the Inuits. So the Inuit do show up, and they come around 1200 and expand down the coast. They get to Hamilton Inlet about 1500, and about 1600 they're down in the Gulf. And we think that it correlates with, as I mentioned to you, the appearance of seals expanding down the coast. Now this next series of things I want to go through fairly quickly is looking more towards the future and the mechanics of what is going on. So people wonder about, this is the greenhouse effect. We all know about the greenhouse effect and the fact that the radiation doesn't get back off the Earth after it's hit the Earth. It tries to escape by bouncing out, but it gets caught in the greenhouse gases, and so it warms the world up. So this is kind of a global thing. But you also have this big difference between the global mean temperatures and the Arctic mean temperatures here. So consistently very much higher. So the question is, why is the Arctic warming faster than others? And one of the reasons is because as the ice cover melts, whether it's off the land, because you have earlier springs and later fall, or off the seacoast, is opening up the surface of the ground, which is darker than the snow, or the surface of the ocean, which is very dark. And so all the thermal radiation is able to be absorbed. So there are lots of reasons why the Arctic is warming faster than other places in the world, and it's become kind of a bellwether for global change. So it's a very, and what the scientists really hadn't figured out until about 5 or 6 years ago is that this is basically a logarithmic kind of thing. So they've been pushing their open Arctic, projections, closer and closer to us. It's no longer 2060 or 2070. It's now 2040 or maybe even 2030 for open water in the summertime throughout the Arctic Ocean. It's because of these feedback mechanisms. This is just another example to show you how that happens. In the wintertime, a lot of energy is bounced back into space, but as you lose that snow cover, it turns darker and absorbs, and the same thing happens over here. As things open up, they absorb much more energy. Caribou and the resources of the Arctic are very affected by these changes, particularly the warming, which causes icing of their feeding grounds, and they can't paw through. They're really expert at being able to dig into the snow, but they can't dig into ice. So when you have a lot of open water and you get more warmer water coming off and moisture in the wintertime, you get these icing events, which are devastating to the caribou. So things like that can have a huge effect on cultures like the Indian cultures and also the Eskimo cultures, but to a little smaller degree. Polar bears we're all worried about now because where are they going to go? There's no ice. Well, what they're doing is they're going to land, and they're getting into tangles with grizzly bears, and we've now had a couple of biological proofs of grizzly bear and polar bears actually mating. So it's an open question what's going to happen, but there are definitely going to be fewer polar bears than there are now, and a lot of people will be very happy with that. People in northern Labrador seem to have congregated all of the polar bears in the Arctic in their territory, and they'd like to see a few disappear. We really don't know why that's happening. This picture is symptomatic of the problems for walrus. As the sea ice melts, they no longer have haul-outs over some of their best feeding grounds in the Chukchi Sea, particularly, also Hudson Bay and places like that. Walrus were, at the end of the Ice Age, they were down around Cape Sable. They had a big colony at Cape Sable Island, but they got killed off by the early European whalers and hunters, and now are restricted to only northern Labrador, eastern Canada, and of course a big population in Chukchi Sea. So here's 10,000 years. Look at all that variability. I mean, Richard Alley and others have shown that some of these changes from full glacial to non-glacial situations can happen within, originally they thought maybe 100 years, and then they thought, wow, maybe onsets could start even in 10 or 20 years. So the Earth is a lot more dynamic than we realize. And here's that spike before the end of the Ice Age. Then it gets very cold, younger Dryas, and then the modern variability here. Here's a chart showing temperature changes just in the last century. These, not much. Here's from -1 to 0 to 1 centigrade. But those things, even though they're relatively small, cumulatively they have a huge effect. Here is the past 1,000 years in the Northern Hemisphere. This is recent work by Darrell Kaufman. You can see this slide over the last 1,000 years. This slide is thought mostly to be the result of orbital shifts. This is the angle in which the sun shines on the Earth. And it's an astronomical thing that can be predicted. And we are in a period, we have been in a period where that solar energy is diminishing because of orbital shifts until this point here. And this is actually instrumental records, this red. This is based on models and proxies over here. So we are in a definite hockey stick situation. And a lot of people, of course, are very convinced that it's the CO2 which is the driver of those changes. These are some of the temperature projections. This is great if you're a non-believer. You can show that there's no way you can predict what's going to go on. It's a big mess. But it just does show you that there's a lot of variability, but there are also clear trends here. And precipitation projections, here's the same kind of huge variability. These models are really, they're not very substantial yet. They're being refined rapidly, but we just don't have enough data to be sure, and the world is still a big place. Sea ice decline is another very important thing that we've been seeing, documenting here over the course of 100 years. Very definitely, this is the autumn and the spring, so these are seasonal, but they're all showing these marked declines. And this is the average area. This is the extent of, in square kilometers, of the reduction of the Arctic ice in the Arctic Ocean. And if you look at it this way, here's the, this is the dotted line. Is 2000, that's that minimal ice year when I was in Wrangell, right there. Doesn't look like much, but it's like 8% of the entire ice in the Arctic has gone. And if you look at it this way, this is 1979 to 2000 over here. Look at the huge change. And these are satellite pictures. And these are projections moving from around 2015 to around 2050 to around 70 to, So we're in an interesting time for sure. Vegetation changes likely are going to be from today. This is tundra, and this is the boreal zone. You hardly see any tundra except in the easternmost Canadian islands and a little bit in Timor. So there are going to be big shifts in all sorts of ways of life. This is a little shot I took of a railroad. This is one of Stalin's railroads. I'm glad I didn't see it in person from the Yamal, and just to show you what melting permafrost does. I wouldn't want to have been on that gulag. This is the relatively wet summer tundra in Russia. A lot of water there. As permafrost melts more, there's going to be even more water. So transportation, all sorts of changes in animal migrations. Of course, it's going to be great for birds. This is the erosion story from the Arctic Ocean. Here is the open water days. Here's 63 days. This is off Barrow, Alaska. Back in the 1980s. Today, we're up in this period of 96 days, and we're headed for we've been to 105 already days. And just this shows you that another way to look at that. But what it's doing, it's chewing away our coastlines in the north. This is Barrow. And, if you don't have those coasts protected by ice, the sea is crashing in. You're getting bigger fetch. Basically, you're making an ocean out of the Arctic Ocean. It's going to be like the Atlantic and the Pacific with big fetches and huge changes in erosional profiles. So they're losing lots and lots of houses along here. Occasionally, a prehistoric house falls in, and that's great for the archaeologists if you find it in time. But it makes it a little difficult for people living in the north. And Ted Stevens used to say, what are we going to do in Alaska? Because not only it's Barrow, it's like Kotzebue, it's all these other places which are low-lying places that are being gobbled away by rising sea levels or by abrasion like this. And we have no idea how all these changes are going to affect this global circulation of the ocean system. And there's some real serious thoughts that there may be some major changes that could, plunge Europe like this winter into basically almost like an ice age, while things get much warmer over here. We really don't know. These things are just not yet well enough understood, but I think we understand enough that we need to be careful and try to do what we can to stem this. Here's the Vinland map. I'm almost done. Anybody who wants to go see this, go to the Beinecke and bother the curators, tell them that you need to really look at that map carefully. They actually were a believer in this thing, but I think they're kind of non-believers now, but there's still a lot of people arguing for the veracity of the map, showing Greenland here as an island. Here's Vinland down here, Helluland up here, Markland, Labrador over here. The parchment it's on is actually dating to the 1400s. It's okay, but it's the ink that's the problem. And if any of you are chemists and have followed the Vinland map ink story, every year or so you can get a whole another taste of this controversy between the proponents who believe it really is a genuine map and the others who are sure it's fake. One of our historians actually thinks she's tracked this back to a Jesuit priest in the Nazi period in Germany who was trying to make the glory of the Germanic early days and the Norsemen palpable to the Nazis, and so he created a map that showed Greenland as an island and lots of opportunities for Germanic peoples. This is the percentage of native populations in the north. You see very small wedge in Russia because Russia has replaced most of its people with Russians in the Arctic. But when you get over the New World, here's Greenland. It's like 80% indigenous people. Canada, about 50%. Alaska is smaller. So these are the peoples who are going to be affected most by these changes that we're seeing. Changes in their subsistent patterns and the appearance and disappearance or complete absence of certain animals they've depended on. And we're really not sure where this is headed. This is a fun slide of a Sami guy he's not really worried about it. And if you talk to most of the Inuit people today, they basically are non-committal. They say, yeah, things are changing, but they've changed in the past and we'll adapt. So this is basically the story. It's going to happen one way or the other. People have to adapt, and as I've shown you, the archaeological perspective on this shows that there have been huge changes in the past. People have adapted. Some didn't get along too well, and others made time. So, it's going to happen. What's different now is that the Arctic Ocean is going to open up, and we're going to have ships from China and Korea coming back and forth. We don't have any infrastructure for that kind of stuff. There's problems with pollution. There's a whole host of things. And if you talk to people who are the political scientists and the planners and policy people, it's sort of like, I'd say in the last year or 2 years, the government has waked up to this problem. And of course, the Arctic Council is a new body we have, which is dealing with a lot of these issues. All of a sudden, a place where when Elmer Harp went up north, there was no one there except some native people to talk about. Now everywhere you turn around, there's a helicopter and all sorts of things happening. As well as indigenous people more or less in control of their local governments now, which is a big change. So that's my story, and I want to thank you for being very patient. And of course, I'll be happy to answer some questions.
So I know some people need to leave. Feel free to do that. On the tradition of Dickey Talks, we always give students the chance to ask the first question. So we have
Everybody's a student, right?
the whole front row is filled with students.
Are they still asleep? Let's try it the other way around. Yes, ma'am.
So you spoke a lot about cultural encounters historically. So and kind of alluded to some of the future changes in the Arctic and on the cultural side, but kind of without really even considering the climate change component, what do you think about how cultures are coming together and what that means for
I'm not sure exactly what what you're driving at. You know, in the historical period, we saw lots of migrations. You know, cultures moving around, adapting to climate change. That's being reflected in the contemporary scene today. Not so much by indigenous peoples moving around; they're kind of in their areas and where they're probably going to stay. But look at the the European or the Russian or the sort of white component in the Arctic. All of a sudden, all of miners and oil drillers and all this stuff. People are heading to the north in a major way. So there are a lot of changes, but it's in migration and things like that from outsiders. Most of the native communities are governed now, have their own governments and operate in a way they want to. Greenland's probably going to get full independence from Denmark within 10 years or 20 years. They're having a lot of, you may have some heard Archaeology talking about the problems that Greenland's facing as it becomes more independent. How does it pay for its way? Denmark isn't going to pay anymore, so then it's resources. So they have to sacrifice, some of their water power, some of their subsistence resources. They're drilling for oil, endangering maybe the fishing to some degree. So people are confronting, these issues, but at least now they have a say about it. It's not just Copenhagen or Washington or Ottawa just doing it, So it's really unpredictable about how climate's going to affect all these things, but it's coming, and people are concerned. Hillary Clinton went to Greenland, had a big ministerial conference up there. It's the first time anybody in the U.S. government had sort of said, "Look at the Arctic now." And I remember the other time when I remember somebody doing that. His name was Mikhail Gorbachev, and it was 1990, and he had just become head of Russia, and he said, we got to take care of our north, and same thing happened in Russia. A lot of interest. That's subsided quite a bit. Yes, sir.
I had the opportunity to meet Prince Charles on Baffin Island many years ago. Interesting bits of stuff. The British have been interested.
Right, and the Pope. The Pope was up in northern Canada. So a lot of people are paying attention.
Are there any places where the dog sled still rules over the Bombardier snowmobile in the Arctic?
Yeah, but you better go quick. It's northern Greenland. And around Disco Bay area, up in Umanak in that area, I have a good friend who's been working up there, sort of documenting changes, and they're facing a shift from basically a totally dog sled winter hunting pattern for sea mammals and for fishing and all sorts of things to an open water system. And all the families had dog sled teams. I was there a couple of years ago in the summertime, and the dogs were howling in the wilderness, and they were out there throwing fish at them, but they're shaking their heads because why am I feeding these dogs? I mean, I got no ice for them to go on in the wintertime. So it looks like the dog sled tradition as a subsistence way of life is gone, except in a few places. What's happened, though, is a lot of people have picked it up as sports. And so a lot of northern people maintain dog sleds, for like the Iditarod or for local games and stuff in the wintertime, but not on the sea ice. Sir?
Doug, could you say a word about nutrition over the years? I mean, if you read USDA recommendations for food, they're recommended for children and adults these days. It's a far cry from the kinds of food types that I believe were available over the years. How do these people survive nutrition?
They still have a lot of country food that they eat. There's a lot of fish, and in some areas there are seals available. But most of the northern peoples are succumbing to the grocery store mentality and eating a lot of carbohydrates and drinking a lot of Coke, and teeth are falling out. And there was a scare a number of years ago about pesticides, and I didn't really talk about that, but all of the pollutants that are generated in the mid-latitude regions go up, and they go up to the pole area where they descend and spread out over that area. And there have been some studies showing high levels of mercury and other pesticides and things. That seems to have died back a little bit now, and maybe the scientific evidence is not as clear, or maybe it's not as dangerous as people thought, particularly for mothers feeding, breast milk and so forth.
And just a quick follow-up on that. Do you have any idea of what the life expectancy of those nomadic people was 2,000, 3,000, 4,000?
Yeah, in the days when you could do physical anthropology, which is difficult now because most of us don't ever dig burials any longer. But from the collections that were made earlier, in fact, I came back with Elmer from Hudson Bay in 1967 with two Inuit skulls in a box that he found in stone graves. They were very prominent. This is like the Thule culture. The Dorset people, where they buried people, we have no idea. Maybe on the sea ice, or just left them out on the land, but we have almost no bones. But from the Thule culture, they put them in stone cairns, and very obvious, and they kept dry or at least aerated so they didn't deteriorate. And many of those are quite old. I mean, people live to be 60, 70 years old. The biggest problem for most Northerners is that rambunctious adolescent period when people are on their dog sled or are hiking around and they go over the thin ice and didn't know it was thin, or get stuck in a snowstorm that they should have avoided or something. So a lot of the younger people died. But their populations rebounded very quickly. Bob McGee once had a theory that there was a big die-off from influenza. Well, influenza did hit people, not so much in the Central Arctic as in Labrador. But there were other times when people thought maybe the European diseases got into the Arctic from the Norse or from the early explorers. But I don't think we really have much evidence of that. It just seems like those populations were isolated enough so that they did quite well. Usually when you would see their bones and their teeth and they're, perfect. It's like the Mongolians. Very similar. Yes, sir.
You mentioned modern climate change maybe helping out with discovery of sites like in
Right.
Russia. And you also mentioned like past climate change with like resources to Thule, reindeer hunters to whale hunters. How would you characterize like the voice that archaeology or paleoanthropology in terms of educating people on the potential circumstances of climate change as you discover more instances of those shifts as a
Yeah.
result of-
Well, we're not very good at prescribing the future. Anthropologists are. I know in Russia I had colleagues who were sort of like told by the government, you have to help people, you have to tell us what to do to avoid social unrest, political problems between, get those anthropologists out there and study them and give us a solution. It doesn't work so easy, and I think with climate change, it's sort of a similar story. I mean, the native people will find ways to adapt. They're very ingenious. They know their environments, their animals. They have good technology, good communication, and a lot of them have very good schooling now. So I pretty much would say would leave it to them. And actually, there's been a huge change in the way we do research in the North over the last decade. It used to be, like the anthropologists go out and live with the family, or the archaeologist goes and digs up somebody's, site over here and brings it home and stuff. And nowadays, that's never done. I mean, we work in collaboration with the communities, with native people as, partners, as co-authors, and all this kind of stuff. And we just had a big IPY research experience over the last couple of years, and Igor Krupnik works with us and at the Smithsonian, was responsible for really spreading that philosophy wide into other areas of science as well. So the people who really know their lands now are having a lot to say with what their future is going to be and how we should interpret it and so forth. So that's a good sign. But in terms of specifically climate, people are they're starting to buy motorboats instead of dog sleds. Only way.
Well, maybe that's a good place then. I want to thank Bill for an excellent presentation. If you have other questions, just come on up front. Okay?